Welcome back again to Solving Basketball. I am Jordan Sperber, and today's guest is the sports reporter for the Albuquerque Journal, Geoff Grammer. Thanks for coming on, Geoff. I really appreciate your time.
I'm honored, man. I'm pretty stoked to be on this podcast right now. So, been listening to it since it started, and seriously, really honored to be on it, and look forward to this.
Well, thank you. I know you have been listening, so I know you're ready for the first question, which is, if I was in Albuquerque right now and we walked into the pit practice or the arena's practice gym, and I went under the basket, you went to the foul line and shot 100 free throws in a row, how many would you make out of 100?
It wouldn't be pretty, man. It's been a while. First of all, it's been a while since I've shot, even just like at a practice or something like that. So I hear everybody on your show talk about getting into the 60s and 70s and 80s, and some of them even come up with an answer like, well, probably not that good, maybe just 65. And I don't buy any of that. I think a lot of these people, a lot of my fellow media types that you have on especially, I think would be a lot closer to like 50% because we'd start getting tired at like 20 or 30. So I'm going to follow suit and probably overestimate, and that's how pathetic I think my number would be. I'm going to overestimate and say I'd probably be able to get to 50.
Okay. Yeah. That's a common critique, I guess, I've gotten from listeners, is that people do think that guests are overestimating their free throws, which is probably true, but I guess you can still compare them to each other. If everyone's overestimating, then that's okay.
Right. Well, was Corey Alford your first one?
He was number two.
Number two. Okay. Yep. So I remember listening to your Corey Alford one and I can't remember what number he came up with, but he was the only one. And it's only because his last name is Alford. He was the only one that I thought, you know what, I'll bet he could do better than he thought. And pretty much everybody else I hear you have on the show, I think, that's at least 5 higher than I would guess. So
yeah, well, we really need to test this. Being an analytics person, we really need to start testing and then have a little inflation, I guess.
That would be awesome. If you do that, I'm all for getting the word out there on the true numbers between all these or behind all these podcast guests.
What is basketball? What is this basketball? Is that basketball? What is basketball?
The free throws question always kind of leads into just the guest's general basketball background.
Yeah.
So obviously you cover Lobo basketball, but you haven't always. So what is your basketball background?
All right. So basketball background is I grew up single parent home, mom, not all that interested in sports, an older sister, not all that interested in sports. But I played as much sports as I could growing up just with friends, but sports was never big in my family, but it was always big for me. I was a big football fan growing up, still am, probably football more than basketball. I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I had a babysitter's husband tell me when I was really young that the SF on the side of the helmet of the 49ers stood for Santa Fe. So I thought the Santa Fe 49ers were my NFL team. And it was probably a couple years of thinking that before I realized Joe Montana and Jerry Rice didn't actually live in Santa Fe with me. But I decided to like them anyway. But that sort of shows you my background in sports did not come from family. It did not come from being around it a whole lot. But I tried to play it as much as I could. In high school, I did football and never played even high school basketball. So when I got to college, actually it started in high school. I wrote we had a high school paper in Alamogordo, New Mexico that got published once a month in the local Alamogordo Daily newspaper. They would print our high school edition once a month. So I was a sports reporter in high school. All my best friends were really good athletes. 2 of my best friends, one of them was a 4-year starter at New Mexico State as defensive tackle, played in NFL Europe, had some workouts for NFL teams, stuff like that. Another one of my really good friends was Ryan McDermott. He was a 2nd round pitching draft pick of the Cleveland Indians, tore his rotator cuff, ended up playing for the New Mexico State Aggies for a season for Lou Henson after his baseball career did not pan out. And a lot of my close friends, my group of friends was all not just athletes, but there was a good run there at my high school. So I was really involved, but I was certainly never going to be a guy playing a whole lot of sports. I did, like I said, I played high school football, but when I got to college, I knew I wanted to do journalism. I wanted to write about it. So my background's been pretty much from writing about sports from the start. And I got my start, like I said, in high school, but really going at it at the Roundup, the student newspaper at New Mexico State University.
So to, I guess, move forward a little bit. So
Yeah.
how long have you been how long have you been covering University of New Mexico basketball?
So I've been at the Albuquerque Journal right now. I've been covering UNM basketball since the 2012-13 season. So this is my 7th season. And I had some stops in between college and there that had crime reporting in it, courts reporting. I was a sports editor in Las Cruces at the age of 25 and covered New Mexico State basketball and football then, covered an 0-12 football season. Went out to Arizona for a few years, covered some high school, some U of A football, some spring training baseball, and then our newspaper shut down, so it brought me back to New Mexico, but I was doing news again. I was doing crime and courts reporting until the summer of 2012 when the opening at the Albuquerque Journal for a sports reporter for Lobo basketball opened up, and I got a call, asked me if I was interested, and I absolutely was.
How unique or not unique is that to have the crime background and the news background for a basketball writer?
It is unique, and I don't think it should be. I think, I talk to some journalism classes sometimes, and there's a couple beats that I think really lend themselves both to entry-level reporting and to, if you give years and years at it, you can become pretty good at it. And I think crime reporting and I think sports reporting are two of those things. There are guys that can, right out of college, if they happen to land a good gig and they're covering a team, they can be sitting next to somebody that's been covering that same team for 40 or 50 years. There's some veterans in this business that have been going at it for years. And they can both cover the same game and can both put out an okay story, pretty equal. And I think the difference between experience and inexperience, in small sample sizes, and you're someone who's appreciative of sample sizes, and small sample sizes won't be very telling. But it's really the grind, the over the course of an entire season or even just a month or 2 months, that's when I think veteran reporters learn how to keep it going and keep it interesting for their readers and how to keep their contacts and their networks up with coaches and stuff like that. But it's all about keeping the interest of the reader. And that's what we all have to worry about. And we all have different audiences too. So I'm certainly not reporting or writing for a national audience. I have to know my local audience, and that's a lot different than some of the national guys, than the Jeff Goodmans, the Norlanders, even the Rothsteins and stuff like that. My audience is not the same audience as theirs.
So we're gonna get into that a little bit, the New Mexico fan. But first, we met, beyond just some Twitter interactions, but we met in person at New Mexico's and Coach Paul Weir's coaching clinic.
Yeah.
And I was somewhat surprised that you were there. So I actually spoke about analytics and using analytics at the clinic. There was a sports psychologist, or were you not supposed to call him that? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Something like that. And then,
I think performance coach is what he wanted to be called, I think.
Yes. And then their strength and conditioning coach talked. Coach Hunsacker talked about pressing.
Yeah.
And so what was the purpose for you attending that?
Well, I think that kind of goes into what I try and bring as a newspaper beat writer as opposed to this national audience. When I'm covering just one team like I am, and for those that don't know, Albuquerque, New Mexico is a pretty unique spot, I would say, and we can elaborate on that later, but a pretty unique spot in how much it really likes and consumes the content on Lobo basketball, even in bad seasons. They still want content all the time. Now, there's a good number of people that would just like player features over and over again. Tell me how good Tony Snell is and Kendall Williams and these guys that have come through here, the Grangers. There have been some good players in the past 10, 15 years that have come through here. And anytime you can mention them in an article, there's a good number of people that will just eat it up and love it. But what a lot of people want too is year round kind of daily coverage of the team. And that's hard to do sometimes in the off season. So when I saw who was coming and I saw what this camp was going to be about, and it wasn't just, here's how we do our pick and rolls and here's how we do, our press offense or something like that. When it wasn't just the X's and O's, that Paul Weir's coaching clinic was actually kind of bringing in people like you and having the strength coach talk about some of the other things that go into building a program that have nothing at all to do with even on the court kind of X's and O's. I thought, look, that would be a good opportunity to show what this coach I'm covering, his approach to things, because as you know, Paul Weir isn't really approaching this like a whole lot of other coaches. I mean, he ultimately, he's still a coach. He's still, maybe he's not reinventing the wheel entirely, but he is trying to incorporate a lot more analytics than I'd say the average coach. He is trying to incorporate health and diet and last year I did a story on them doing yoga that got so much readership at our paper and still gets talked about. Just because I think it kind of crossed over a little bit to people that maybe weren't all that interested. But wow, there's this coach making his players do yoga. And that's not even all that uncommon anymore. I think a lot of teams do that. But here in New Mexico, here at UNM, that was kind of unique. So I think people trying to explore the uniqueness of what Paul Weir is doing right now is there is an interest level here for that. So that's why I went to that camp and I loved it, man. I loved listening to your presentation and I think all the coaches there probably broke down a wall a little bit for the old school coaches that don't even like hearing the word analytics and got them to this understanding of what you're actually doing when you're using all these numbers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was fairly nervous for it. It just really not knowing what to expect about the setting. It was pretty cool though, being right in the pit like that.
Yeah. Had you ever done one like that? Had you ever done that presentation? Had you ever done it before?
I had been on like a panel at a basketball analytics conference, and really the difference here was it being more to a coaching audience as opposed to people that think exactly like me.
Right. I mean, yeah, the friendly atmosphere of an analytics conference, a little different than high school basketball coaches, I would think.
Yeah. And honestly, I think it better fits my interests and kind of my mission almost to be talking to coaches as opposed to analytics people that might be better at like computer programming or something like that than me. So I think it's good. It was just new,
Well, I think there's a lot of people, and it's not just coaches, but a lot of like readers or a lot of fans who have an interest in analytics, but almost have an ego about them that they can't admit right now that there's something about basketball they don't know or they're not comfortable with. And for a lot of these people who have been around basketball 30, 40, or 50 years, that's these new analytics. It's not just a stat sheet that says points and rebounds. It's breaking down these numbers and what do they actually mean in the game. And I think they're a little nervous to admit that. So, I mean, breaking it down the way you do, I know I retweeted that one video you have a couple times. That's as good a starting point to me as there possibly could be for even old school coaches that are just afraid to publicly admit they don't even know what the heck analytics really bring to the game. And but it's also for fans too, and regular readers that aren't the biggest basketball hoop heads out there, but they can understand what all these analytics are. And it's really simple when you break it down the way you do, and you do a good job of that. But I think it's also part of the game nowadays. So it's silly not to have that incorporated into your viewing and your coaching if you're a high school coach.
Yeah, the best example that I have is at one of those MIT Sloan analytics conferences years ago. I think it was Herm Edwards, maybe. It was a football panel, and it was Brian Burke, who is an analytics guy who now works for ESPN, and they were talking analytics and about fourth down decisions, and Herm Edwards was so focused on trying to find something that the analytics guy, Brian Burke, was saying that was flawed, or, well, it's not accounting for this, or it's not accounting for that.
Yeah.
You couldn't get anywhere. It was just never going to get anywhere, as opposed to like he was just providing a baseline is what Brian Burke was doing. And then all that line of questioning was supposed to go into it afterwards. But and so that's where if you look at it as very black and white, it can be tough for a coach.
Right. I think you almost have to trick them into not realizing that the word analytics is a bad word to some old school coaches that just don't want to hear it. They almost think of it as this new soft generation of kids that don't like being in the gym and don't like working hard and don't like being yelled at. That's what they want. But analytics is just breaking down the numbers that have been there for years. It's just a different way of looking at all this stuff. It was all there years ago. It just wasn't being explored the same way. So I think there's a hesitancy still from the old guard. But man, I really think finally we're kind of to the point where there's not a whole lot of that going on anymore. At least I hope not.
So in your work for the Journal and for UNM fans, what is their appetite for analytics?
It's evolving, I would say. I thought about this before this podcast. Like, that first season I really dove into, and before I started working at the Journal, I worked at a paper in Santa Fe. I was doing crime. There was one season and that's for those that don't know, that's about an hour away from Albuquerque. They do a little bit of Lobo coverage, but not a ton. And in the 2010 season, the Lobos had a 30-win team. They were a 3 seed. Finished the season, I think hovering around the top 10 or something like that. Because that team got so good, I covered that Lobo team too, but wasn't traveling with them until the NCAA tournament and all that. So I've covered them before I was at the Journal as well. But in 2012-13, that was Steve Alford's last year at UNM. There was my first year covering them. There was a lot of talk about who had the best defense in the Mountain West, and there were some Lobo fans that are very active on email and would email me daily about my coverage. And they had this idea in their head that the best defense in the league would be the team that allowed the fewest points. And that year, in 2013 season, in the Mountain West, and I'm pulling up KenPom right now just to kind of have the numbers in front of me, but there were 2 teams that were hovering around 60 points allowed per game, and it was UNM and it was Wyoming. And I think at one point I wrote something to the effect, and I usually don't have these kind of statements in my articles, but I think I said something that the Lobos had the best defense in the league that year. And I was checked on that. I was told, no, how could you say that? You're such a homer. Wyoming has the best defense. They're allowing 59.2 points a game. Well, the difference is Larry Shyatt was coaching that Wyoming team, which was, I think they went I want to say something like 4. Yeah, I'm looking at it now, 4-12 that year. And New Mexico, went 13-3, won the league by 2 games comfortably, and had a much better defensive efficiency rating, but they were allowing 60.1 points a game. Now, the tempo difference is when I started to realize I don't think there's a whole lot of educated basketball fans here in Albuquerque necessarily. There's a passionate fan base. For those that don't know, the Pit, home of the Lobos, for its first 50 seasons in existence, averaged top 25 in average home attendance in the nation. And that included some thin years, some bad years of Lobo basketball. They weren't certainly not always going to the NCAA tournament. It's a program that has never, this surprises some people, but has never been to the Sweet 16. But they averaged top 25 in average home attendance for the first 50 years. The last 3 years, that's dropped off to as low as 33. Right now, they're back in the top 30, but they still come to games. But this is a program based on the fans a lot more than based on any postseason success. So they're a passionate fan base, but I don't know how educated some of them always were. And the best defense in the Mountain West was not a Wyoming team that was 4-12 in league play. It was a New Mexico team that was 13-3 in league play, and efficiency-wise was just light years ahead of Wyoming. So I tried to figure out the best way to start to articulate that kind of stuff to the readers and in my writing without just annoying and just hitting them over the head with all these numbers that they weren't used to getting. And that's at the Journal and other places too. We're rarely using these kind of analytics just even 7 years ago. So that's really when I started trying to figure out the best way to explain basketball, not in a pompous way. I wasn't the guy to explain basketball to these people. That's not the best way to put it. But I was trying to give them a different look at how to break down what they were watching on the court every night than they were getting for years. And that's when I started really diving into KenPom and that kind of stuff. And the appetite, I think, has grown. I incorporate, basically in almost every story now, I work in some kind of reference to, rebounding or free throw rate or just something that isn't their average rebounds per game or their points per game. I try and incorporate some number that you can't find on the traditional stat sheet.
So if you are incorporating one of those numbers, obviously there are some of your readers that have seen you use them throughout the years and now they have a really good feel for it, or maybe they just have an interest in it so they have a good feel for it regardless. But how much do you have to pretend like they don't know anything and introduce that concept in the next article?
Yeah, no, quite a bit. It is a tough balance. This again, I think is sort of the difference between a lot of beat writers that cover just one team in a community, maybe the size of Albuquerque or even smaller, that aren't writing to a national audience. If you're going to read ESPN.com or CBSSports.com and read some of those national guys, you're already interested in that topic. We're still trying to get our local readers that flip through each section of the paper sometimes interested, so they might not be going to the college basketball story first. So sometimes I have to tell them, what a certain stat means in parentheses, if nothing else, like what a free throw rate means as opposed to just how many free throws they shoot per game and stuff like that. So every now and then I have to be reminded that not everybody knows, what a block percentage is or something like that, as opposed to like if I tell somebody a team has a block percentage and I throw out a number, I'm just looking again right now at like a team that has 10.5 block percentage is Nevada right now in the Mountain West. If I throw out the 10.5 number and don't explain what that means, people are assuming that means they have 10.5 blocks per game, which isn't true. So sometimes I kind of have to explain those numbers within a story. And if you're a national reporter or you're a national hoops head that knows what that means, it really sounds kind of elementary, if you will, to read sometimes the local beat guys that have to sometimes explain that. But other beat guys don't have to worry about that. I mean, Newell, for instance, Kansas, he's been doing analytics, incorporating analytics into his coverage for forever. And I don't think anymore he's explaining to his readers. I think he has his readers fairly well trained. They know what they're getting when they go to him. So I don't think he's explaining it as much as anymore. And I think I'm explaining it less and less because I think the readers are becoming used to me incorporating those numbers. But for a while there, it was tough. And I think I mentioned this to you when we talked last year at that coaching clinic. I had one guy that up until just about a year ago kept getting so mad at me when I would reference what this KenPom guy is and what his rankings were, as opposed to just using the RPI, which he said was always so much better. He's the only guy I know that ever said the RPI was better than KenPom and these other things. But he would email me and my editor, said, tell Grammer to quit using whatever this KenPom guy is and RPI. Everybody uses RPI. It's the right way to go. And so there are still some people out there, and we have to, I guess at the newspaper level, sometimes remember that our readers aren't necessarily the ones that are reading us just for basketball coverage.
You mentioned Jesse Newell, and he was on an episode of Solving Basketball, and we talked about the dynamic between a head coach and a beat writer and the fact that you're relying on information to try to break news potentially, but also covering them objectively.
Right.
And so that's a spot for analytics, or just really analytics is one way to cover what's going on the court.
Yep.
So one thing that comes to mind with New Mexico this year, and this has been a pretty common topic on Ken Pomeroy's podcast, is all the different starting lineups.
Yeah.
So for the listeners that don't know, probably most of them do because of Ken's podcast, but Paul Weir, the way he has done starting lineups, at least for a lot of this year, is based off of hustle stats. So deflections and back tips. And actually, at least at New Mexico State, where I worked for him, he called it whatever it takes. Like WIT was really our team name for it.
Right.
Early on in the year, and I haven't necessarily been looking at it too often lately, but I know New Mexico had been getting off to slow starts.
Right.
And so if you were to look at it, I guess, straight up on the numbers analytically, ideally you'd want some maybe context to see like other teams that have switched their starting lineups a lot or whatever. But at the end of the day, they had been inefficient in starting games.
Right.
And so how do you go about covering that? Because clearly it's like a staple of Paul's culture. and so it's hard, I think, because it hadn't been working in the same vein. So how did you cover that particular topic?
So you're right. They were getting off to horrible starts in the first like 2 minutes of games. It would start evening out after the first couple substitutions came in, which for Paul is usually about 90 seconds into the game. He sends his first sub in, maybe 2 minutes in, you're already 2 or 3 subs in because he rotates so heavily, which sort of, I think, also annoyed him a little bit, that so many people were getting annoyed by his starting lineups, because it really was such a small sample size of the game. It was like 90 seconds, but they were consistently down 6-2 or 4-0 with that starting lineup. It was at least a couple buckets a game that they were, we're talking like a full month or probably like 10 games into the season. And they were averaging, I think, starting lineups, the various starting lineups were averaging, I think, -4.5 or so. And those we're just talking like 2 minutes, the first 2 minutes of the game. So as you said, though, his culture is based on, he came to this realization, he says, that, what can you do to get people to actually get your players to actually buy into what you're saying? And deflections is the number one priority on this team. Deflections is the word he uses now, but you're right. It's whatever it takes. It's the hustle plays. It's getting a hand on a ball, a steal, a block, taking a charge counts. Those things kind of count. And so he would base his starting lineups every week or every game on who had the most deflections per game, per minute, the previous game. And then at halftime, he would start a starting five that had the most per minute deflections in the first half. So that was great a year ago, when a team that was picked ninth ended up finishing third in the Mountain West, had a 7-game winning streak going into the Mountain West Conference Tournament Championship game against San Diego State. Still had a lead at about 7 minutes to go in that game, almost made it to the NCAA tournament. And this was a team of nobodies, everyone just, the narrative was they had no talent, but they bought into their young new coach's philosophy and culture to work hard, and people loved it. This year, when they had higher expectations because they recruited pretty well and they had some talent, the deflection starting lineup thing, it was, a week or two into the season when you started hearing the grumblings about it. And now it's almost like a bad word. You mentioned deflections, and fans go crazy because they think it's just a stupid way to start a game, but it continues to sort of be a staple for him. So the way I had to report that was, first of all, use the numbers, break down exactly what is happening as best I can, but then break down why a guy who might only be playing 4 or 5 minutes started that game, or why there were a couple times he had a walk-on start the game. Well, the reason is the one thing he asks his team to do is, these hustle stats. And the previous game, he had this many hustle stats in these many minutes. That's why he is starting. And once he starts as a coach breaking from that kind of general rule that this is what I'm going to base my starting lineups on, then maybe he's starting to bend his philosophy, and what he stands for. So it has been a struggle convincing readers that I'm not for this or against it in any way. I'm just trying to explain to them this is his philosophy. And then when I explain why that walk-on was starting, like what his numbers were, people take that sometimes as me justifying it as opposed to just trying to explain it. So it is a tough balance sometimes, but that's how you got to do it. You got to use the numbers as best you can to explain why it's happening.
So there is another dynamic, especially with Paul, and again, maybe the non-Mountain West people or just West Coast basketball in general aren't totally aware, but he was the head coach at New Mexico State. He was an assistant coach before that for a lot of years there. The New Mexico State-New Mexico rivalry is very significant. Having worked for New Mexico State for a couple years, it's very important in the community.
It is.
They play twice a year. So New Mexico State plays UNM twice a year and UTEP twice a year, which in non-conference play, which is pretty unique. Not only did he leave for the rival school, but the reporter, yourself, went to New Mexico State, is an alum, and obviously now covers the Lobos. So describe that dynamic a little bit.
Oh, it's fun. It is fun. And obviously you're asking because you're aware of a little bit of it. It's so yes, I'm a New Mexico State Aggie graduate. I covered them in college and again when I was sports editor in Las Cruces for a while back now. So I was the Aggie that got the Lobo job in a lot of people's eyes and minds when this happened about 7 years ago, and I would still today frequently be reminded of that, especially if the Aggies played well and I wrote a story that happened to have a final score with the Aggies winning, which I didn't have anything to do with other than reporting it. It would certainly be pointed out to me. So my biases are a hot topic, and it has sort of gone both ways though. And when Paul got the job, and I knew Paul well from his time at New Mexico State. Obviously, the Albuquerque Journal covers New Mexico State in a secondary role. The Lobos are our primary beat, but we cover New Mexico State a little bit. And if they get to the tournament or something like that, we certainly try and go travel with them. I cover them in Las Vegas during the WAC tournament if I can, those kind of things. So we cover them some. It's not like we're totally ignoring New Mexico State, but there's no question who our primary coverage or team to cover is, and that's the Lobos. So that annoys some New Mexico State fans sometimes. And so I have some New Mexico State followers and readers and fans that certainly give it to me every time I can about somehow betraying them and betraying New Mexico State by even covering the Lobos, or in my coverage, not just kind of hammering the Lobos every chance I get. And on the flip side of that, as one would expect, I have a lot of Lobo fans. Anytime I'm critical of the Lobos as the beat writer, pointing out, oh, he's just saying that because he's an Aggie. So I've had that going on for about 7 years now. From a very early point in my 7 years here at the Albuquerque Journal, I decided just to have fun with it and play it up. I instead of ignoring it on social media or an email, I just kind of point it out. I do a lot of retweeting of people critical of me and play along with them a little bit. So I think most people realize by now. I don't think everybody there's natural biases in all of us, and you try and suppress that as best you can as a journalist. And I think I do a pretty good job of it for the most part. But I just kind of try and point out to people like I don't have a dog in this fight. I might have gone to New Mexico State. I might cover the Lobos. But whether this game is a win or a loss that I'm covering, I'm still writing the same 20-inch story. I'm still writing a follow-up tomorrow. I'm still writing an online column later tonight. I'm still posting some video if I can. Everything I do doesn't actually change based on whether I'm rooting for one outcome or the other. I still have work to do and I still have a job to do. And I think most people realized that a couple years in, that like I didn't have any kind of rooting interest as they might think. And but yeah, I still get reminded constantly about being the Aggie homer or the Lobo homer, and sometimes on the same story I might get accused of being a homer for one of the two.
So Twitter is Twitter, like that's just inevitable, I feel like. But my question is, your bosses or the higher ups at the Journal, is there ever conversations about that, or is it just something that is being discussed on Twitter by fans who just are going to pick apart something no matter what?
So within the sports department, everybody knows, for sure, everybody knows that I am a New Mexico State grad. I don't think I've ever had at any turn my editor accuse me of being pro or anti either of them because of that. Whatever problems I have in my reporting, which come up for any reporter, have never crossed the I think you did that because you're a fan or because you're a hater or anything like that. That's never come up in sports. I don't even know if some of the bosses outside of the sports department even realize I'm a New Mexico State graduate necessarily. I mean, they might have when I was hired, but it's never come up once in conversation. Now, I do have some editors who are big time supporters in the local community of various things, but including Lobo athletics. And they're very aware of it, but they don't, they've never given me a hard time about it or suggested it has, been a part of my coverage at all. So I think the people who need to know at the Journal are aware of it, but it's never once become an issue or anything like that.
Moving back to the Paul angle of UNM, NMSU, you were telling me a little bit before we started recording that readership or just the numbers are up a little bit. Can you explain that now that we're live?
Sure. There's look, newspapers are doing what they're doing right now. The numbers are tough. A lot of colleagues of mine everywhere are losing jobs and readership is down, circulation's down, all that kind of stuff. One pretty good constant at the Albuquerque Journal has been Lobo basketball coverage through the years, and just tracking interaction, be it on social media or on our website, and when we post videos, just even on Facebook or anything like that, just tracking stuff. We can tell who's reading, where this interest is coming from, and the numbers, even in a down year. For those that don't follow Lobo basketball, they're sub 500 right now. The readership is really good, and tracking where that's coming from the last couple of years, there's a lot of outside Albuquerque interest, and a lot of it's coming about 3 hours south of here, and that's Las Cruces, New Mexico, where Paul and his wife came from, and Paul worked there for 10 years. So there's, I'm sure, a small number of that Las Cruces readership that is people that like Paul, that are friends with Paul. But I suspect a good number of that, based on my interaction on Twitter with a lot of these Aggie fans who reply to every story I post, especially the losses. I suspect a lot of the coverage we are getting now, and a lot of the numbers we're getting at the Albuquerque Journal are hate readers. And I'm all for it. Hey, keep reading. I love it. If the numbers are going up, just keep reading. That's what I'm here for. So, but it's interesting, man. The amount of interaction we get on social media on our posts and the reader comments often are outnumbered by Las Cruces or New Mexico State fans that are just, very critical, obviously, of Paul for leaving the rival and going to the other school. And that's fine with me. As long as people are reading, ultimately, that's what we got to keep doing. So it doesn't affect how we cover the story necessarily or how we're reporting on it. But, man, it's been fun to watch how many New Mexico State fans now interact with me on a daily basis because Paul Weir's the coach here.
Sometimes I can't decide if University of New Mexico basketball is so distinct from the rest of the country, or if it's just that since I was a part of the rivalry, right, or if I'm focusing on it. But it seems like there's a lot of stuff that I don't know about from in other fan bases. And an example of that is, so if we switch to off the court stuff.
Yeah, there's always something off the court here, man. There's always something off the court.
So actually, a former UNM assistant coach, I guess I'll keep him anonymous, although I don't. It's not that big of a deal. But when he was an assistant, I remember him telling me, like, yeah, I go to the bathroom here and the fans are talking about it, or, so something like that. So just the coverage, basically.
Yeah, no, it's true, man. It's weird. Like, so my daughter at school, she's in 4th grade now, but like other parents sometimes find out that, my daughter's, that her dad is the guy that covers the Lobos. And so, like, they start telling her, like, and it's not always fun to like, they give my daughter a hard time, like, oh, your dad's covering the Lobos, huh? Oh, he covered another loss, and she has no idea what they're even talking about. I mean, she knows I work for the newspaper, but, like, yeah, my daughter is known by some people now, partly because I put her on social media and stuff like that, but it's also just classmates and other classmates' parents sometimes talk to her about Lobo basketball, like she has any idea.
And so I think that this is where the name NM Fishbowl comes from. And there's another reporter whose name is Daniel Libet. Well, you know better than me. I probably shouldn't be the one introing him, but has covered off the court, off the field, off the whatever about UNM athletics,
yep.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Daniel Libet lives in Chicago. He's from Albuquerque. Went through high school here. He actually had an internship, I think, one summer at the Albuquerque Tribune, which was the afternoon paper here. It shut down years ago now, but had a little bit of a run-in with, or not run-in. That's not what I meant. A little bit of a run with the local newspaper scene and journalism and stuff like that. Went to the University of Wisconsin. Has been primarily a political reporter for years. He's always had an interest in diving into covering a college team, any college program, from a very different approach than anybody's covering. I mean, and he chose his hometown, Albuquerque, being where he's from, his hometown UNM Lobos, to do that with. It started off as an experiment for about 2 or 3 years before he did it. He and I talked a lot. We've become friends. But it started with a very critical eye that he turned to the Albuquerque Journal in particular, and how we were covering, or in his mind, not covering college basketball. And I remind people of this all the time. And you can ask Dan this yourself. Anybody can. He's more than happy to interact with anybody on social media at NM Fishbowl, his NM Fishbowl account on Twitter. He does not think UNM is unique necessarily. He thinks any college that he chose to do this, what is now a 2-year kind of experiment on, would kind of have these problems. And the problems I'm talking about, he uses open records. He's filed 4 lawsuits now. He's used open records law in the state of New Mexico, which are very good open records laws on the journalist side. But he reads through emails. He asks for every email the athletic director sent out or received within like a year, and he just goes through them, and he wants to see what they're going through, what they're talking about, all these deals. And some of the stuff he's turned up through the years, frankly, is stuff that he's right when he says wasn't being covered by the Albuquerque Journal and wasn't being covered by local media. And it's also not being covered at any other college program anywhere. And these are the kind of behind the scenes handshake deals sometimes. The pit renovation, the arena here got renovated about 10 years ago now, and they put in 40 luxury suites that was supposed to pay for it. It was a $60 million renovation. These suites were supposed to pay for the renovation. Well, they're selling about 12 of them a year now. And there was, communication before they ever did the renovation that said, look, we're not going to be able to sell these many suites every year, but they went forward with it anyway. He's done a good job of kind of bringing that stuff to light, and the sort of, a lot of people here really view it as corruption that's going on with UNM athletics. And there has been an element of that. There's a former athletic director right now who is under, he's been charged by the state attorney general for multiple felonies, which include some money laundering charges, some tax issues now coming up, and fraud. And he went on a golf trip, a fundraising golf trip to Scotland, where he took a lot of boosters and UNM employees and used state money to pay for 3 donors, 3 private individuals, which is against state law. And so there are a lot of things like that Daniel's been really good at making sure have come to the forefront. Stories like that, first, I will say, stories like that would have come out anyway. Those weren't being ignored when, if there's criminal charges against an athletic director and stuff. But what he's done a really good job of is reminding people at a state university and reminding the community that just because they're your beloved Lobos doesn't mean they aren't using taxpayer money. And anytime you use taxpayer money, you have to be held accountable. If this was any other agency in government, if this was the MVD or the Veterans Affairs, anybody that's getting tax money, we cover them a certain way. But for some reason, university athletic departments have always been about game coverage. It's always been about, did they win or lose? Are they going to the tournament? What recruits are coming in? He's sort of exposed the fact that newspapers across the country, and used Albuquerque as the example, just don't cover these universities the way that maybe they should be covered. And he's done a really good job with that. But man, he's not made a whole lot of friends by doing it.
Right. So the you mentioned it, but the reason he's able to do it is because it's a public university, and therefore you can get all those emails and the public records requests. But the flip side of why if he was covering basketball on a day-to-day basis and trying to actually cover the team, that is where it would be an issue. So let's say he's right, and this is not just a UNM specific thing, like the public institutions would not want people doing these public records requests. And so my question is, why isn't it going on in other places? To me, just thinking about it, and I don't know this world nearly as well as the coaching world, but just thinking about it from a reporter, journalist perspective, It would be a huge opportunity for someone.
Well, I think if you look at just the past couple of years, some of the big stories in college athletics that have the scandalous type stories, they get handed off to like the news side of the newspaper or the TV station or whatever. And the sports departments themselves kind of avoid that. And maybe that's where, for me, it's been a little bit unique because of my news background, I guess. And I was a crime reporter for years and a court reporter for years, that I've stuck with doing that coverage myself and covered the budgets. I think that instead of waiting for a scandal to break within an athletic department, be it Michigan State, obviously Penn State, just anywhere where these scandals have sort of happened in recent years. A lot of times, instead of waiting for the story to break, I think what Daniel Libet is pointing out, if you were covering these athletic departments with maybe a news reporter or with somebody devoted to just the news of the athletic department, as opposed to the guy that also covers the games and the player stories, which is what a beat writer like myself has to also do. If you were covering these and watchdogging them like he has done, watchdogging them like a lot of newspapers don't do, then these stories wouldn't be just the last couple of years. We would have known about these 5-10 years ago. We wouldn't wait until something really horrific happens. They'd be coming out a lot more. It'd just be like any other department in government that right now has reporters looking into that kind of stuff on a daily basis. But in athletic departments, there's not a whole lot of people around the country that are just kind of digging into what's the athletic department really doing with that bond money they got for the new stadium? And I mean, did the stadium really cost that much? Are they using taxpayer money appropriately here? Right now, I think people look at college athletics and they think of two stories. It's either the games or it's the pay to play, are you going to pay players kind of story? And that's about it. And then other than that, they wait for a scandal where a coach says something stupid about a player who was accused of maybe a sexual assault or something like that. They wait for it to already happen. I think the uncovering of those kind of things is something Daniel Libet thinks would be happening on a much more regular basis if journalists across the country approached it that way instead of being reactionary. He really thinks that journalists need to be a lot more proactive in finding these stories.
The kind of final question on this is I asked Geoff Goodman, we weren't specifically talking about this, but for a rising reporter or writer trying to carve out their own path, do you think being this proactive reporter is a potential way to do it?
I think there is room for it. Yeah, there's a place in this media world right now for that news kind of angle in college athletics, but you're probably not going to be. It's different than the beat writer role. It just is. I don't think there's a whole lot of college coaches right now more than ever, and college athletic departments with their sports information departments and all their media people around them that will allow that person, that reporter, to really ever have good access to the team. I can tell you right now, I'm around the team all the time as best I can, and I still have to wait 2 weeks for a player interview. Whereas if Geoff Goodman as a national reporter were to call up right now and want to talk to the example I can give, and look, I get things happen and they would tell you this at UNM, oh, look, scheduling conflicts or whatever. It always seems to happen that if I request a player interview, it takes like 2 weeks for it to happen. If Geoff Goodman calls UNM right now and they have a chance to get a national story, they'll have that player on the phone with him that day. And there's a whole lot of hurdles in front of local beat writers that people don't realize. And I'm not looking for sympathy here. I still get to go travel, watch basketball all the time. But the local guys actually have less access, and people don't realize this, than the national reporters. Now, the national reporters aren't the people that are going to be writing to your local fan base every day. They'll write one story about Lobo basketball, maybe 2 a year. But it's the local reporters at the TV stations and newspapers that are actually writing to the people you're trying to sell tickets to all the time. So you would think that the universities would be more open to getting those player features and the human interest stories and those kind of access things out to those reporters, because that's what convinces that, the local, maybe not huge hoophead kind of fan to go buy a ticket that night and take their kids to the game or something. But as far as access goes, I do think there's a place for a young journalist starting out to go do what Daniel Libet is pushing for, which is a really critical open records approach, kind of, watchdog journalism approach to covering an athletic department. And I do think it's something that newspapers should all be doing. I just think it's a really tough balance for the beat writer who's also writing those player features every day and covering the games every day to do.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's the complete opposite of sort of hoop vision or the on the court stuff that I like doing, but I still find it really interesting. And like I said, I was interested to hear your thoughts on and I guess Daniel Libetz as well, on
Yeah.
if it's just a UNM thing or if it's, he happens.
So yeah, I'll add this. Like, so first of all, Dan's not going to be doing NM Fishbowl much longer, he says, but he's been saying that about a year. I think he loves it. He loves the attention. He and I have had a lot of talks about this. He was very critical of me and my coverage and the journal's coverage for a long time, and so I think people assume we're at odds. We're not. We talk several times a week. I think he's done a great job of what he's doing. He just does it in a way I can't as a journalist always do, because he uses unnamed sources, a lot of anonymous sourcing and stuff like that. He also has some resources from a personal level where he can pay for 10,000 copies of emails if he wants to, just to go through all these emails. Whereas the Albuquerque Journal's trying not to lay off reporters. We're not going to pay just for 10,000 copies of somebody's emails just to go through and see what we find, because we can't afford to do that right now. He actually has more resources from a personal standpoint than we do as a newspaper. And that's unfortunate that these are public records, but it still takes somebody with a lot of financial resources to actually do the kind of reporting he thinks should be getting done.
Gotcha. So yeah, that's a potential barrier then for someone just looking for a niche, I guess.
Absolutely.
All right. So lastly here, we'll completely switch topics, and actually we're recording this on Saturday, and the Tennessee LSU game just had Dick Vitale ranting about referee reviews, and that is. I
wondered if you were going to bring this up. This is awesome.
That is in your wheelhouse. I would imagine a lot of people listening know, but whenever there's a referee review, not only do you tweet it, but about 10 people are tweeting it at you, and it's a little game that you have played. Yeah. When did that start? What's the background there?
All right, so if my legacy in life is nothing more, and I have a daughter I'm so proud of, and a family I'm proud of, but if my legacy in life is nothing more than I started a drinking game, I'm a proud man right now. and a couple years ago, I started. So the Mountain West, the Mountain or the West Coast referee, I forget the name of it, but the group of referees out west that officiate the Pac-12, the West Coast Conference, the WAC, the Big Sky, and the Mountain West. So all those referees. You see the same referees over and over again, and there's a couple in particular that I thought a couple years ago really started maybe going to the video review a little too much, and it started annoying me a little bit. It was, it kills the flow of the game. It's needed sometimes. I actually don't have a low opinion of the referees as much as people assume I do, but I thought they were going to the video monitor a little too much, and it started to be the same guys over and over, especially Dave Hall, who's obviously a big target of mine on Twitter, but I don't think he's a horrible referee. I think he tends to do this video review a little too much, especially in televised games when the referees get some screen time. So I started, instead of getting mad about it all the time, I just try to have a little fun with it and point out the absurdity of how often these guys were just killing the flow of games by going to the review. And so I just on Twitter would start taking a picture of referees standing in front of the video monitor, and I would hashtag drink every time. This game's now official because there's been a video review, hashtag drink. And it just started off as a little bit of a joke in my way of pointing out the absurdity of how often they were doing this. This was about, I want to say 3 years ago when I started doing it. Last year, it really started picking up steam, and there are now TV commentators every now and then who follow me, who might be covering a Mountain West game on television, that when there's a video review, they've mentioned me on the air. Carter Blackburn's done it a few times for CBS Sports. I know up in Wyoming, there's some radio people that often, even on their women's games, that do the play-by-play for their women's game. If there's a video review, they bring me up and say, have a drink and stuff like that. So it really started off as just a way to, instead of getting so mad about it all the time and annoyed, I thought I'd make a game out of it. And it turned into a drinking game that really has picked up. You're aware of them because you worked at New Mexico State. New Mexico State SID now will take a picture from, and he's sitting right there at the scorer's table. If there's a video review, he'll sometimes take a picture, and a couple times on the New Mexico State official Twitter account, they've sent me a picture on Twitter that says, video review. I don't think they ever hashtag the drink or anything like that, but it's become known around the league. I've had assistant coaches tell me that there was a video review. I know earlier this season. There was a video review where two assistant coaches kind of leaned back and both looked at each other and said drink at the same time and started laughing on the bench. And I didn't know what they were laughing at. But it was because of that. It was from an opposing team. So it's known around the league. It's kind of become a thing of its own at this point. But I do think it's a little absurd how often they go to the video monitor. But I'm not opposed to replays either. I don't want people to think that. I think you need replays. I just hate that they go to them for just about everything at this point.
Well, first of all, shout out to John Vu, the New Mexico State SID.
That's right.
In case he's listening, you know, I'm giving him a name drop. But
I think he's given you a name drop a few times on social media too. He's always appreciative when you have a New Mexico State stat in anything you tweet out.
Yep, for sure. You just said you're not opposed to the reviews, and that was my next question. Is
Yeah.
You know, Dick Vitale. I wasn't really listening to the whole thing. More so, I saw some tweets, and I heard a little bit of what he was saying. I was doing some film work, so I wasn't very focused on it. But he's saying that, you know, he wants the human element, less reviews. I just feel like if it was the other way around and there were no reviews, Dick Vitale would probably be like, "Oh, we need reviews. We need reviews."
100%. Look, I love Dick Vitale. I have a voicemail on my phone from about 6 years ago when I did a story on a Lobo player, Hugh Greenwood, who was doing fundraising for cancer and stuff because his mom had cancer. And I did a story where I interviewed Dick Vitale. He left me a message that I've to this day kept on my phone. And I guess that's sort of maybe a little bit of the fan in me that's still there because I'm not a huge fan otherwise. But I still have this Dick Vitale voicemail on my phone. And he's just, "Oh, Hugh Greenwood's great, baby." And he just got excited on this voicemail just like he does on the air. And I think it's the coolest thing. But I do actually disagree with Dick Vitale on a lot of things that he says on air and on social media. I think he really pushes the maybe a pro coach's stance. I don't think that's surprising anybody since he used to be a coach. I think he really pushes a pro coaching stance more than I like, certainly more than I think needs to be pushed on air all the time. Dick Vitale's a funny guy, and I agree with you that if there was no reviews, he would be saying coaches are getting, you know, screwed out of winning this game or that game if there were none. So Dick's a good guy, but not always the best champion for any cause you have, other than the great work obviously he does for cancer research and stuff like that.
No doubt, yeah. And then as far as the ref reviews themselves, you could put a limit on them, maybe. Like if you have, I've heard people propose this. You have 30 seconds to find evidence or whatever the case is, and if not, we're playing basketball. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I don't know if the time limit's even the best way to do it. What I really would just I would give them maybe a 2-year window to try and fix this. They always have points of emphasis every year, right? In the offseason, they talk about this or that. I would say over the next 2 years, when you're getting graded at the end of your day, and the referees get graded all the time. I talked to Bobby Dibler, the head of the officiating out west. I talked to him a lot. They grade officials on everything. I think they should start grading officials on how many video reviews they do. And if you do too many of them, like I think you need to start being punished like you would if you're the guy that keeps missing all these block charges or block charge kind of calls, or if you're missing all these points of emphasis. I just think the officials have to take it on themselves to start limiting it, because I don't think it's right to eliminate the replay, but I also don't want to put some sort of arbitrary number on it like 30 seconds or a minute, because what if right at 59 seconds you finally get the angle you need? And well, why can't 105 be the number then? You know, just as long as it takes is fine with me. Just quit going there for so many things, you know. Stand by your call more often than not. And in the final couple minutes, maybe that's when you review plays. I know that over the course of 40 minutes, every play is supposed to count the same and points count the same throughout. But, you know, maybe in the final 2 minutes is the only time you could really review a call. And I'd be okay with something like that maybe.
Well, if they do make it a point of emphasis, I feel like your Twitter account follower growth will definitely take a little bit of a hit there. So from a personal perspective, that might not be best.
I want more reviews. I think more reviews are better. I want to get a sponsorship. Actually, so when I went to Colorado State game earlier this year, I covered a game in Fort Collins, and they have a local beer actually sponsored by the school. And when I did all my drink tweets that game for video reviews, I put in mocking. I certainly wasn't really sponsored by them, but I put sponsored by I think that Old Aggie is the name of their local beer at Colorado State that is actually about the school. It's not sponsored by the school, but it's their trademark and all that stuff. So maybe I can start getting every school to sponsor my drink tweets.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I know the Lobos are off this weekend. What does that do for you schedule wise? Do you get a little break, or is that not till after the season?
Not till after the season. So tonight I'm actually picking up a desk shift for somebody that just needed some time off himself. I could, covering the Lobos all year, I could take some time off right now. It'd be great, but I'm actually going to go spend 8 or 9 hours in the office tonight putting out our Sunday paper. No writing today, but I will be, designing some pages and stuff like that, and catching up on all the other sports going on around town, because there are some other sports going on too.
Well, given that you have all that, thank you so much for taking the time, and also thank you for listening to the podcast and sharing it. I really appreciate it.
No, yeah, I appreciate that, man. I do listen to each one. I know you don't need this, but the approach you're taking right now, the unique niche that's kind of being carved out right now in this media landscape for college basketball it's crazy to think that nobody was already doing what you're doing right now, and for you to be the guy to kind of insert yourself into this media landscape right now and doing it the way you're doing it, it's pretty cool, because it's sort of one of those why didn't I think of that moments, and what you're doing with just trying to solve basketball and trying to explain it from all these different angles, whether it be the media level, the coaches, the assistants. It's fun to listen to, and it's fun to watch whatever your product is grow into, between the newsletter, the podcast, and just your social media presence. So it's fun to watch, man. I'm glad you had me on, and I know I may not have the reach of some of the national guys, but I think the approach you're taking to including even the beat writer level and stuff like that's pretty cool. So I appreciate you having me on, man.
Yeah, and that means a lot coming with all your experience, and especially having worked at New Mexico State. I've read so much of your stuff and respected so much. So thank you.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks.
No hand checking Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc.